Inside IT Automation, a ScriptRunner production.
Yeah, so here we are with another interesting Inside IT Automation episode with Steve Lee from the PowerShell team at Microsoft. Thanks a lot for taking the time, Steve.
Of course, thanks for having me.
It's cool that you came over to Antwerp this year. You couldn't make it last year in Prague.
Yes.
So you're back. This is how many times you have been to PSConfEU?
This will be my third time, so 2 times in Hanover and 1 time in Antwerp.
Okay. And so what is your impression so far? Any highlights from the conference?
Well, I mean, I always enjoy PSConfEU. I don't personally enjoy the travel over. It was a 10-hour flight, and then I had this whole train episode. I don't know if you heard about that.
No.
I basically landed in Amsterdam, and then I took the Eurostar, intended to take Eurostar to Antwerp. And unfortunately, because of the long flight, I fell asleep on the train. And then when I woke up, I got a message from Ben Reeder, who was also on the train, asking if I got off. And right when I read it, the train started moving.
No way.
So I ended up in Brussels. And luckily, it's not hard to translate some of the, I'm not even sure exactly which language it is, but Antwerp was written a little bit differently, but I could make my way.
Yeah.
And I found my way back, so it was all good.
Okay, wow, this was already an adventure,
Yes.
kind of coming here. Okay.
So I got to see a little more of Europe than I planned, so that was fine.
Yeah, let's put it positive.
Yes,
Yeah, okay. Wow, awesome, even greater that you're here. I mean, yeah, so maybe for people who maybe don't know what you're doing, can you explain a little bit your role at Microsoft?
Sure. So first, I've been at Microsoft since January 2000, so a very long time. I started in the WMI side, but my role and my area of expertise has always been in system management.
Okay.
Like whether it's a platform, I was part of the NetIQ acquisition, which became MOM, Microsoft Operations Manager, which got renamed to SCOM, so System Center Operations Manager. Mm-hmm. And that was a short time, and then I was part of the original team that did WinRM for remoting. Much later on, and again, a lot of this is hazy because it's like over 20 years now. At some point, I was, the WMI team and the PowerShell team got joined together, and then I helped out on some of the, I think it was PowerShell 5.1 release. I think it was when I first started having some interaction with that team. And then when there was discussion about taking PowerShell open source and cross-platform, that's when I decided, hey, I want to take that on. Give me that opportunity. So I became I was already a manager, but I was the software engineering manager for that team for that role to kind of go cross-platform, move it to .NET Core from .NET Framework, make it open source.
Yeah.
And at the time, Microsoft was not very big on open source as it is today.
Yeah.
So that was a bunch of legal challenges and technical challenges and all that. But for me, that was very exciting because it's very different from what I did in my past.
Yeah. Okay. And now you're also responsible for SSH and DSC, right?
Yes. So since that time, my portfolio has grown.
Yeah.
So I also was one of the original folks who entertained the idea of bringing OpenSSH into Windows. It actually originally went to some other engineering manager, but came back to me.
Okay.
So I own that now, or have for some time now. PowerShell Gallery was also something I inherited from a different manager.
Okay.
And also DSC v3, not DSC v1 or 2. And then there's some peripheral stuff like VS Code extension, a secret management, a whole bunch of modules, things like that. PowerShell Gallery, PS Resource Get, PowerShell Get. All these things.
Yeah. Okay. As you mentioned DSC, can you explain a little bit for maybe people who don't know what PowerShell DSC is, just so they get an idea why, and also why they should use it actually?
Absolutely. So for those not familiar, so DSC is Desire State Configuration. So, and I gave a great presentation, in my mind, a great presentation at this conference.
I'm sure it was.
On DCV3, and I believe it'll be available later on YouTube.
Yeah.
But basically, and the reason I bring that up is part of my presentation to talk about the history of systems management and configuration, right? So the way things started in the past, and again, I don't know exactly how far back this was, but a lot of, in the distant past, a lot of configuration was on a single physical server, right? And a lot of times the way you did configuration is you went into the GUI, especially on Windows, the graphical user interface. You make a bunch of changes, you validate if it works, and you put like sticky notes to tell other people what is happening, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way that you kind of had knowledge. It's like a very old-fashioned way of doing things, so very what we call tribal knowledge, so it's not well-written and stuff like that. And when something failed, you hope someone had knowledge to fix it, right?
Yeah.
And then as that evolved, and then PowerShell existed, then people said, all right, now we have more servers. We can't just do it manually. We don't have the people power, so we should probably script this, right? So scripting was a big thing. So people were scripting this stuff, and then as the scale of the number of machines grows and the different types and all these things, your scripts get very complex, right? And when it fails, it has like a lot of failure points. You have a lot of different people touching it, so the maintenance becomes much more complicated. So although that solved the previous problem from manual to automation, you now have a different problem to maintain, right? So where DSC came about, and there are other tools that are similar to DSC. So DSC was not, let's say, a complete new invention, but it was like new for Windows, right? Which is to say, configuration as code. So you write your configuration of what you want it to be, and then these things called resources, just like in PowerShell we have commandlets, and in WMI we have like WMI classes and providers. They do the work, right? So rather than trying to have all this logic to say is install SQL Server, configure it this way, now install IIS, and hope things succeed, you actually just say, I want IIS, I want this website, I want SQL Server, these databases, and things happen. And when things get out of spec, there's other tools like local configuration manager and stuff, or higher level tools like Azure guest config that can detect drift and notify you or try to fix it and stuff like that. So DSC v3 is the latest iteration of this project. We actually had not made a ton of investments in v2 for a while. So I'll just briefly go over some of the history of DSC. So v1, again, I don't remember the year of when this happened. This is Bruce Payette was one of the creators of DSC, actually. So he'll tell me the exact timeline, but it was created as part of Windows PowerShell. I think it came with 5.0, and then I think 5.1, around that time, I forget what, this is all fuzzy because I was not directly involved at the time. But with v2 and the PS Desire State Configuration module, one of the things my team did contribute to is to make that open source cross-platform, although there are limitations in the cross-platform aspect, right? On Linux, because DSC v1 and v2 depended on WMI. WMI doesn't exist outside of Windows. There is this other project called MMI, which is no longer really funded anymore, and didn't succeed where I think Microsoft originally thought it was going to succeed, I'll put it that way. And so basically, that all existed for some time, but it was limited, and it was strictly tied to PowerShell, right? And so one of the conversations I had, I want to say maybe a year and a half to 2 years back, was with one of my peer teams, which is Azure. I'll say I'm going to use guest config and machine config interchangeably because it's the same team, and I think it's a rebranding. Okay, but let's call it Azure machine config. So I was talking to them and say, what are some of the challenges? And they depend on DCV2 today for both their Linux and Windows workloads. And I was like, all right, what are some of the big challenges you have, and how can we help if we think about a new version of DSC? Because the community has always been asking, what are you going to do about DSC, right? So one of the main things they brought up, which kind of started this whole project, was really their customers love the idea of DSC. They love declarative language, configuration as code. It all makes sense because if you have configuration defined as code, you can check into a Git repo. You can look at difference of what changed. You can have versioning and all the great stuff you get with the Git repo. So, but one of the things they said is, a lot of their customers, like big customers, are not Windows users, or they may not, even if they are Windows users, they're not PowerShell users, right? And if they're PowerShell users, they're not developers. So asking them to write a PowerShell class was also, all these are kind of like barriers for adoption, right? And for these customers, even though there's a great community of DSC resources, the customers also need resources for their specific software that they built in-house, right? So this was a big blocker for them. So for me, it's like, all right, how do we address this? And the way to address this is we really need to enable our customers and our third parties and first parties to write resources in any language that they're more comfortable in, right? So if this, let's say it's, I won't name a business, but let's say it's a big business, and let's say that they predominantly write Python or Go or something else, right? It's like there's no reason we can't allow them to not participate in DSC, but we need to figure out how to enable them to write those resources, right? And as part of that kind of journey and discussion, it's like, all right, we also need to kind of talk to other partners within Microsoft and see what their needs are. And the initial outcome of all of this discussion is, all right, we need to support resources written and stuff outside of PowerShell. We still need to continue to support PowerShell-based resources because that's where all the resources are today, right? And I expect that over the next few years, the predominant number of new resources will still be written in PowerShell. It's just, in my mind, it's easier, and I'm a little bit biased. And over time, I expect to see stuff that are just executables to also just become resources, right? So that's one of the big changes. You don't need to have PowerShell, but you also don't need to have whatever. You just have your executable. You take JSON as input. You spit out JSON back to DSC engine, and that's kind of like the communication channel. There is some schema, so it's not like just free form for the most part. And it's all documented today, but it is a little bit complex, and we will have more. And also, because I know this is one of the feedback I got out of my session is, right now it's still a work in progress. I'm hoping to hit GA this year, sometime.
So it's not publicly available.
It is publicly available as a preview,
Okay.
but it's not. You should not use it in production.
Okay.
It's not production ready yet. All right?
Okay.
Yeah. So that GA meaning general availability is when we say it's production ready.
Yeah.
And also, we're starting to talk to some first-party partners. Like I'm partnering with Winget, right, heavily. They're going to start looking at integrating with DSC v3. Obviously, Azure Machine Config at some point in the future will integrate, and some other teams that we're talking to that I can't announce right now.
Okay, interesting. And it also so in the past there were MOF files, right?
Yes.
And now the format.
So right now, so MOF, for those who don't know, managed object format came from WMI, which came from SIM, this whole standard that was relevant years ago, but did not take over the industry as Microsoft hoped. Okay.
Yeah.
So MOF is not popular, and MOF requires a very specific parser, which is not readily available in different languages. Now, what is readily used and readily available, and although it is not the best solution for everything, it worked out well in this case, which is JSON, right? So one of the things we looked at is, we want to not reinvent the wheel or invent some other new standard where we don't have to. So one of the things we decided early on is we're going to use JSON as the intermediate exchange format between resources and DSC engine itself.
Okay.
There's a different thing. We don't necessarily have to get into how PowerShell works because we don't expect the PowerShell classes to emit JSON. So we have this whole adapter concept, and we wrote our own adapter, so it works with all the classic resources. But that's the kind of basic idea. Now, for those who don't know, JSON and YAML are basically, you can convert from one to the other with some minor differences. But for our part, we also support YAML, right? Because as humans, it's much easier to read YAML than it is to read JSON because of all the braces, the quotes, the commas, and all this stuff.
Then does this also mean that then now it becomes easier to use this in combination with things like, I don't know, Ansible, Puppet Chef, and things like that?
So I don't know if that I think that will help for sure because they don't have to deal with MOF, right? Yeah. But there's other work that we're doing in the DSC. When I say the engine, it's also the command line tool, dsc.exe, that is deliberately designed for integrators like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, and those folks, right? Because a lot of them already integrate with V2 using invoke DSC resource. But now we made it a little bit easier for them to leverage the DSC command line tool to call into DSC v3 resources.
Okay, got it. So can you tell us a little bit about, let's say, the process from, there is DSC v3, so how does it, there is the idea of doing it. So how is the process of who decides and how long does it take to say, okay, yes, we're actually going to start to look for, how long does it take, how many resources do we need? We think we need this period of time to reach a certain milestone. How many people are involved in that process? Can you a little bit
Sure, I can
share some?
I can give some of those details. So how do I best put this? So what I mentioned earlier is like this whole concept, right? Started with a conversation with the Azure Machine Config, one of my peer teams, to see what are the big challenges they have, and what are things that my team can do to help them succeed. And so from that discussion, in my mind, I had two ideas initially, which is, hey, let's move away from, we want to support the old stuff. Old stuff meaning specifically PowerShell, script, and class-based resources, not the legacy MOF-based configuration, right? But we also need to move towards the new world, and that would be JSON-based. So with that idea, I started having conversations with like PMs, like Michael Green, who was formerly a PM on the Azure guest config / machine config side. And he has a ton of experience on DSC v2, right? So I was talking to him about this idea, and he liked it. At the time, Jeffrey Snowbird was still at Microsoft, and I talked to him. I talked to some other folks to just make sure like I'm not missing anything fundamental or why this wouldn't succeed. So after I got like agreement, right, then basically it was up to me to figure out how to fund it with resources.
Okay.
Right? So I don't have a big team. I think I have something like 12 or 13 direct reports right now. And again, remember I have like OpenSSH, PowerShell Gallery, PowerShell 7. There's a lot of stuff. People are already kind of spread a little bit thin. So in order to fund something new, you have to defund something else, right? So in this case, I couldn't defund something else because everything else was heavily used and needed the people on there.
It's really important.
So as of right now, like I am myself the primary engineer on DSC v3.
Okay.
Right. However, let's say over the last 3 to 6 months, I've started getting some two folks, Tess, who primarily works on OpenSSH, and Andrew, who is kind of splitting his time mostly on OpenSSH as well, but he also does some PowerShell stuff.
Okay.
And getting like, let's say about 50% of the time on DSC v3 to help out.
Okay.
so that we make more progress.
Okay.
So now that we kind of have a smaller team, we made a lot more progress.
Yeah.
We went from alpha to preview, which means that all the big features are in right now, and we're just kind of tackling some smaller stuff or feedback that we're getting from partners and fixing bugs and stuff like that. But yeah, it's been also fun for me because it means I've had a lot more opportunity to write code.
Create something new.
Yeah, but it's also hard because at some point I got to figure out when we ship support, I actually need some other full-time people to make sure that
and documentation, obviously.
Oh, documentation is covered because Mikey Lombardi does he does also some other PowerShell stuff, but he's also dedicated for the content developer for DSC-V3.
All right.
So all the documentation and the schema that you see published, he gets full credit for all that. Okay. And he's still working on like onboarding documentation to help new users, maybe some transitional documentation to if you're on V2, how do you get to V3 and stuff like that.
Okay. And so if people, let's say they start testing the current version, which is for testing, they can also kind of contribute, let's say, feature requests or ideas, or is there a GitHub repo that they can go to?
So one of the things I want folks to recognize, like folks who are, let's say, classic Windows PowerShell users, like because I've been at Microsoft a long time, I used to be in Windows as part of WMI for a very long time, right?
Yeah.
And one of the big mindset differences for customers is that in the old days, like under, let's say, Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, when things were developed more in secrecy and it gets announced, when it gets announced, it is GA, although we used to call it RTM, released to manufacturing, because they actually released it to manufacturing to press these disks and stuff, right? At that time, it's considered done, right? And I think a lot of people some people still have the mindset that when we announce a product, it's ready to be used, right? So with open source, like the stuff that we do with like new versions of PowerShell, DSC in this case, like we announce stuff early so that we can get feedback early, so that if you do have some things you need that are blockers for your business, we could do it while we're doing it development, versus once we quote unquote GA and it's final, changes become a more difficult discussion, right? Is it a breaking change? Are we going to break someone else and stuff like that? So that's why it's important that we try to be transparent and say, hey, we're going to give very early previews. Keep in mind that things are not working exactly, right? But we do want you to test out some scenarios. Like again, don't use it in production, but do early development. Maybe give us feedback on the design, give us feedback on what works, what doesn't work. We want that early so that we can address it now.
Which also fits to the HL way of developing things nowadays, not just putting some waterfall and there it is.
Yes, and before I forget, so the repo is on GitHub, so GitHub/PowerShell/DSC.
All right. So for everyone who is interested, we're gonna have the link into in the description of when the video gets online. Yeah, cool. So of course we also have to talk about PowerShell 7.
Yes,
for sure. Which is, I mean, at the first day they did this live survey asking the attendees, and it was like 50-50, I would say.
It was actually, I think I saw the final numbers, and it was 50-50.
Yeah, it's between Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7.
Yes.
So for someone who's kind of at the moment still kind of thinking, oh no, I'm going to stick to Windows PowerShell, what would you tell them? Like, okay, why PowerShell 7? So
let me cover two different things, and I'll cover your question specifically, all right?
Sure.
I think one of the reasons why it ended up being 50-50, one of the big reasons is that, and I know that people ask me this all the time, like, why isn't PowerShell 7 inbox?
Yeah, when is it part of Windows?
Yes, because there's a large, I don't know how large, but there is a segment of customers where their department doesn't allow you to install anything that's not inbox, even if it's created and published and signed by Microsoft, which PowerShell 7 is, right? So in those cases, they're limited to 5.1, or there may be also some integrator partners who can't touch the actual customer box and install stuff, right? So these are scenarios I understand. So that's why I think that 5.1 usage will still be not small for some time.
Yeah,
all right.
pretty sure,
Yeah, so the question is, why would you move to 7? So there are some known, some deliberate and some maybe less deliberate breaking changes. So it's not 100% compatible with 5.1, all right? And part of that incompatibility isn't because of necessarily changes in PowerShell. There are some changes we deliberately decided because we think it's better for, one of the ways, when I talked like Jim True was one of the original founders of PowerShell, like the way we think about some of these features and breaking changes is, all right, do we think about the last 20 years or do we think about the future 20 years? And what is the best decision in this moment in time, right? So we made certain decisions that we think is better for the future of PowerShell and the community that resulted in some breaking changes, right? So that's one of the reasons why we have PowerShell 7 and different versions of 7 being side by side with Windows PowerShell 5.1. So going back to the question, so in 7 we have a lot of new features. I think besides .NET itself, but PowerShell itself has also improved in performance. So there are many cases where if you just run the exact same script, assuming you're not doing something that requires .NET Framework, right? If it doesn't require .NET Framework specifically, it should just work in PowerShell 7. Again, barring some minor deliberate breaking changes we made in some commandlets, but it'll probably just run faster.
Okay.
But then you have stuff like for each parallel, which is very popular. So that used to only work in 5.1 workflows.
Yeah.
PowerShell workflows is not supported in PowerShell 7. And the feedback we got is that the majority of folks use PowerShell workflow primarily for parallel.
All right.
Okay. There are other reasons to use workflow, but that was a predominant reason, which is why we invested in that for PowerShell 7. But we also have some language improvements that was requested by the community to make things more easy. We have, in PowerShell 7, we have better integration with Windows Defender application control. Okay. So this is how you can lock down a Windows system, so even protect against like bad administrators. Okay. Obviously, well, there's a hardware administrator, if you will, that will set it up, but the software administrator would not get access to certain things. So for example, in PowerShell 7, we have support for WDAC audit mode. So one of the challenges for people trying to leverage WDAC is what we call it internally, but this is the Windows Defender Application Control. Okay. They may have renamed themselves again, I don't recall. But anyways, it used to be called Device Guard and all these things. But anyways, one of the challenges people have is when you lock down the system, then PowerShell knows this, even 5.1, and it works, it'll put itself in constrained language mode. All right. This means that many things don't work. You can't call .NET APIs. You can't. There's certain types you can't use. There's also other policies that can be placed. You can only use like signed stuff that's trusted and things like that. So basically, a lot of things that people thought would work is now more secure doesn't work because it is secure, right? And the big challenge that I think people may not understand with constrained language mode or lockdown mode is that even if you sign all your PowerShell scripts, it may not work exactly the way you expect. So the reason is that if you sign a PowerShell script and that signing cert is trusted by that system, the script will run in full language mode, which is what you expect. However, if you have a pipeline that calls a trusted script and you pipe something to another trusted script, then during the interchange at the pipeline, that's running in constrained language mode. Right, so there are certain types that can't cross that barrier. There's certain things. So these are things that people don't anticipate. So then, what WDAC team did, on kind of partly because of our ask, is add this audit mode. So if you enable audit mode in PowerShell 7, again, this is not supported in 5.1, then basically it will run everything in full language mode. But where PowerShell 7 asks WDAC and knows if something will fail, we log an event, and we'll tell you why it will fail. Right? So now, what you can do is you can turn on audit mode and you can run all your existing, again, run it as signed scripts, and whatever fails, now you have a way to know and fix before you actually turn on enforcement.
Okay. All right, so that's good to know. So performance is
performance is one, new capabilities, new features. I think the web commands have, partly because of the community, to be honest, has added a ton of new capabilities to the web commandlets. We have stuff like JSON schema support now, besides just convert to and from JSON. I mean, I think, to be honest, I can't name all this stuff off my head because we're already shipped, well, since 7.0, we have 7.4 out, and we're working on 7.5 this year. But I know that the content team, like Sean Wheeler, has always done a great job with a what's new page in our documentation that captures between the different versions. So I'd recommend going there versus trying to expect me to remember everything.
So many things, sure.
There's been a lot of changes. And again, I would say approximately, not in terms of the number, but in terms of the overall impact. I think half the impact has come from the community, which is great, and the other half has come from the team in terms of the type of changes happening.
I saw the number also on Monday, like 10, wasn't it 10,000s of contributions?
There's yes, there's been a large number of different individual contributors and also the total number of contributions. And there's been a few names. I'm not going to call it here because I'm going to forget somebody and they'll get upset. But there's been a few, I think, real stars in the community that really have been. I saw the word cloud. Yeah, the word cloud.
It was.
Yeah, and some of them are at this conference, by the way.
I know. So, okay, so people should start at least consider looking into PowerShell 7, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it works side by side with 5.1. So if you have existing scripts that work in 5.1, you can just keep it that way. Nothing will break. But because it's side by side and it's signed by Microsoft on all that good stuff, then you can certainly experiment and see what can help with new scripts.
Yes, and see the benefits of that.
Yes.
But so as you said, this question that always comes up, like, okay, will it be part of the OS at one point?
So let me address that. I'm very used to answering this question because I know, and to be honest, I'm never bothered by somebody asking for it because I think it's a good indicator they want it inbox, right? So that's always good. But the main reason we haven't shipped it in the inbox literally is really primarily, and again, I don't want people to feel like I'm throwing this other team under the bus here, but basically .NET, which used to be known as .NET Core, has a at most 3-year support lifecycle, right? Windows requires a 5+5, which is 10 years, and typically Azure will extend it more if you have that Windows hosted in Azure, right? So it could be like, I don't know, 13, 15 years, something like that. So basically, .NET team, which already has a dedicated team to support .NET Framework indefinitely, because they'll probably never get removed out of Windows, they don't want to be back in that business because their charter is really the modern lifecycle right, going forward.
Okay.
So because of that, we can't ship something in inbox in Windows today that has a limited life cycle or that we continuously update it and potentially break folks, right? Because one of the expectations of Windows, especially for enterprise, is stability, right? So instead of that, we've done a lot of work already to try to make it as easy as possible to install on.
It's in the store. You can get WinGet.
Yeah, WinGet in the store. If you install the MSI, and I think we changed the default, so you will get Microsoft updates. So once you install it, you'll get auto updates via Microsoft updates, stuff like that, right? Again, I understand there's a segment of customers who can't do any of that, but for those who can, it is really easy to install.
So the way is it's much easier now than
exactly. And because of the MSI package, you could use like SCCM, WSS, all these other tools that Microsoft has to deploy it
wherever
broadly.
you need it.
Exactly.
Awesome. So looking into the future, anything that you can talk about where PowerShell is heading, that maybe feature-wise?
Sure. So I can talk about 7.5 and maybe even some ideas I have for 7.6. All right. So again, we release a new minor version of PowerShell 7 every year. It always takes the latest version of .NET, which also ships every year, and we actually align our schedule specifically to their schedule. So if they happen to slip, then we will also slip.
All right.
Okay. And it's also probably not a surprise for me to say, because they've been pretty consistent on this. They typically GA in November. So then PowerShell 7.x, whatever version that is of that year, would also GA at that same time. And we'll probably have a release candidate because they have a release candidate in September. So they usually have 2 release candidates and then a GA. So we'll follow their schedule. So we're already shipped a couple of previews of 7.5. There's already been a ton of community contributions. I think most of the improvements in 7.5 so far, I mean, there's been improvements across the board, but one of the areas I've noticed a lot of community contributions is on tab completion. So there's been a lot of improvements in that space, and that's primarily more for the interactive user. But there's a lot more areas where you'll get good IntelliSense that you wouldn't have gotten in prior versions, for example. But one of the areas that my team is investing in for 7.5 specifically is this whole concept of a pseudo terminal. And without going into the nitty-gritty details, basically what a pseudo terminal allows us to do is to get the output of a native command, when I say native, like an executable, without disrupting how it works, all right? So one thing that people may not be aware is that, so you can get output from a native command today by piping it or redirecting it to something else, right? But when you do that, the native command can, if it chooses, to know that its output is being redirected and behave differently. So one example is like on Unix, there's the ls tool. So on macOS, for example, if you ls and don't pipe it, you'll get colored output, right? You'll get like directories get a different color and stuff like that. But if you redirect it, then you don't get the coloring because it knows you probably don't want all those VT codes in your output, right? So if we were to just like redirect the output everywhere, then we would disrupt that behavior and you get surprising things for users, right? But a pseudo terminal basically sits between the physical actual terminal and the process. So from the process perspective, it's just writing out stuff. We can capture it, and then we can redirect it to the actual terminal to present it to the user. Right? Now, all this is all academic at this point, right? But the benefits of using this is really there's 3 scenarios that we're trying to target with this. Once we have this capability in, it's still work in progress, which is, from a security standpoint, one of the things we know from experience is that some commands I won't pick on any one individual, but there are some commands that, not nefariously, but you might make a request and the output it dumps to the console may contain like a token, like which is a secret. Right?
Yeah.
Like you may not want like someone standing behind you to see it, for example, right? Or in the case of using Azure DevOps pipelines or any kind of CI tool, you may not know that that output is logged somewhere and now your secret is stored somewhere that someone else could potentially retrieve, right? So one of the features of us being able to capture this output is we can determine, does that part of that output, from without going again the details, like we're probably leverage other tools from like Windows Defender teams, stuff like that. But does it look like a secret, right? And if it is, we can redact it from presentation, right? So we can replace it with like maybe like 3 asterisks or something like that.
Yeah,
so we don't even want to give the hint of the length and stuff like that. But obviously, we would not interfere if you're actually storing it in a variable or piping it to something else. So you'll get the raw content, right?
Yeah.
So that's one example where because we can capture the output, we can do stuff with it. Another example that we want to do, so we talked about the redaction. I'm forgetting the second one, but let me get the third one. Maybe I'll remember the second one in a bit, unless you remember from the slide deck. So another area that I'm personally interested in is and this has been a release and multi-year journey, which is a lot of the folks who use PowerShell only think in terms of commandlets, right? And PowerShell as a shell and being a glue language can work with many things, right? Especially, again, what I'll refer to as native executables, right? You can work with stuff like Git, Docker, kube control, all this stuff. But when you use these other tools, they emit text, right? You don't get the nice thing of objects and stuff like that. So one of the ideas we have to kind of solve this gap, right, is really to say, hey, if a native command knows that the shell can accept, again, it'll probably be JSON because it's just predominant in the industry. If the native command knows the shell can accept JSON and it has a way, and we have an idea of how we'll have like what's called like a manifest to inform, so we just don't do it automatically, right? But if it tells us, then we can intercept the output and then we can automatically transform it to like a PS object. So then for the rest of the pipeline, you just do PowerShell stuff, right? Select object, all this stuff, right?
Okay.
So that's one example. I wish I could remember. There's another example I wanted to do with the pseudo terminal, but maybe it'll come to me later.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good point to. Because obviously we have to talk about AI.
Yes.
Because I was really surprised when during the opening session that I think it was Stephen who showed the Start AI shell. I thought, whoa, because until now I only knew about DuckThings module around AI, and that looked like something happens from your side as well now, right?
Yes. So I'll say a couple of things real quick here. Like we on the PowerShell side have been working. We've been trying to figure out how do we leverage AI to make users productive in the shell for a while now. Okay. Right. I don't remember exact timeline. I want to say maybe 3 years ago. I actually wrote a prototype which I call PS Copilot. Right. Okay. It's not public. But I was trying to explore. This is when OpenAI with ChatGPT first came out, and I want to see, and I know that other folks in the community have done similar work, but I want to see, what kind of experience can we build that is PowerShell-y, if you will, that would make users more productive, and not just because of AI as a checkmark item, right? Yeah. So from that, I had some internal discussions. We actually presented to like the MVPs way back when. We got some good feedback, but it took us a while before we evolved it into what it is today. So currently, we're calling it Project Mercury. So it's a code name because we're still trying to figure out what the actual branding name will be in the future. But Project Mercury as a repo is public as of this conference. So again, it's on GitHub PowerShell Project Mercury.
All right.
You can play with it. It is, but I'll mention before anyone plays with it. It is still very early. It is intended to be a developer preview. Okay. And when I say developer preview, it is intended to. It's open source, but the idea is that it is a platform where you can build what we call agents, right? So an agent would be maybe talking to OpenAI, talking to Llama 3, or other large language models, stuff like that, right? So we're not limiting ourselves to just one, which is OpenAI or Azure OpenAI. We want to kind of just enable the community to say, hey, there's these different language models that are suited for different things. The tool itself, the executable is called AISH for AI shell. Again, that may or may not change in the future. But that executable is does not require PowerShell, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do early on was to make sure to get the most addressable market for this is we support, it's independent of the shell, right? You can use it in Bash, you can use it in CMD, you can use it in PowerShell. Right? Now the only exception there is that because we're also the PowerShell team, we will have better integration with PowerShell than you will have with these other shells. Simply because we can't make those
Which
changes
is
in those other shells.
obvious,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
It's obvious.
and expected.
Yeah,
in
it's
a way.
expected. So for example, if you have not seen a demo, I'll kind of just, like if you do the Start AI shell, then, today in Windows Terminal will pop up a different side panel. That way you have a view of both your shell that you're working with, and then you have the chat session. And then you can actually move data between the two channels, right? So if you have an error on one side, on your shell side, you can send it over to ChatGPT, ask it how to, what happened, how to fix it.
Yeah,
Or if you ask directly in the chat session for something, you can now get that content back into PowerShell, and then it's integrated with like prediction and all this, so that you don't have to cut and paste and type. It's like more integrated.
Okay. And as an end product, so to speak, will it require any kind of, let's say, any kind of Copilot licenses or something to get it to work?
So that's a good question. So as of right now, because it's a developer preview, if you're using OpenAI, for example, then you will need an OpenAI key.
Yeah.
So, we're not providing. We're not. My team is not funded to provide and pay for a language model right now. So
of course.
It is for developer preview. We'll have to figure out what that for the future for non-developer customers what that means, and I don't know yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Right now, think of it purely as a platform.
All right. Okay. And so, timeline-wise, so now it's a very early version. What do you think of? What's the idea of having it publicly available? GA?
So
something?
I don't know right now what a timeline looks like. Like one of the reasons we wanted to announce it at this conference is actually. One of the things we're not sure of is like, what are all the scenarios that people might have an opportunity to use AI, right? And there's some obvious ones in our mind that we're working towards, like, if you have an error, you can ask AI, especially for not an advanced user, like, why did this happen and how do you fix it, right? So there's some more obvious ones, but we want to know, like, from just people today, if you are using AI, and maybe today you might have it in a browser next to your shell, and like, rather than going to Stack Overflow, you're just asking questions like, what type of question are you asking? When do you ask questions? And so that way we can learn from that feedback early on. So it's much earlier on than DSC v3, for example, right? So I don't think we have in mind right now a timeline.
Okay. But just like with DSC, there is a repo where people can communicate and
so Project Mercury is the name of the repo. Off of PowerShell org on GitHub.
Okay.
So feel free to open up issues. You can install it. There's instructions on how to set up an agent.
Okay. It sounds to me like still, of course, PowerShell has a great future and things moving forward.
Yes.
New functionality is coming in, so it's still a platform, a language that people should start when you're a system engineer, start learning and start automating with, right?
Absolutely. I mean, like we're still trying to fulfill like Jeffrey's promise, right? Like if you learn PowerShell, you'll only be more productive in the future. The way you get productive might be a little bit different. Like DSC does not require PowerShell. It can't use PowerShell, but you can be more productive that way. AI, again, we're doing the integration work. In PowerShell 7 itself, we continue to add capability where we think it makes sense. But also keep in mind, because I discussed this with a few folks at the conference, like when we had the PowerShell 7.0 release, which is our, when we shifted from core to just calling it 7, that was really our main, or our big come out party, right? And that's where we did a bunch of like language changes and stuff like that. And although there are always requests for like additional language changes, one thing that people need to understand is like, if we change the language in a version, it actually takes the community many years before before that version becomes predominant, that you can expect that language capability is available and use it, right? So these things lag by like years. So that's why like we're not, although we may take some small changes, like we're not looking at very big language changes right now, for example. And a lot of the enhancements have been more in commandlets where you could, if you wanted to, you can do some detection or whatever the case may be, so that it's compatible with older versions of PowerShell.
Like secret management module, for example.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's a great way of moving forward, and also to still have something for the Windows PowerShell folks.
Yes.
That they can benefit from, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. So yeah, thanks a lot, Steve, for taking the time. I think a lot of interesting information for people already using PowerShell or thinking about using PowerShell. So again, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Of course.
Great stuff.
Thank you.
And see you next time.
Yes, anytime.
It's great. Bye-bye.
Bye.